This video was brought to you by the fine patrons on my Patreon page. These videos are totally ad-free, and if you like this content, take a look at the Patreon page in the description below and consider donating to keep this channel growing. On to the video. Planescape Torment is all about choices. Oh, shit. Hang on. I'm getting a phone call here. Hello?
Hi there. Is this Strat-Edgy?
Yeah, this is him. Who's this?
My name's Colin McComb. I was one of the designers on Planescape Torment and the creative lead for Torment Ties of Numenera. I hear you have some questions for me.
Yep, so before we went into our Thanksgiving break, I had contacted Colin on Twitter, and he was kind enough to accept some interview questions that I had. I don't know if I took advantage of his time in the best way that I could have, but I thought that the questions were at least pretty good. It answered a lot of questions that I personally was very curious about. What I'll be doing is I'll be sprinkling in some of his testimony, let's call it, as the video progresses. Let's start with the video, the premise, the theme, if you will. Planescape Torment is all about choices. Not necessarily choices in the game, though there is some of that, but the choices we've made in the past that send ripples throughout time. It plays with many ideas, but what it plays with the most is the idea of death and rebirth, and how with each new life we become a different person based on the circumstances of our rebirth. You can even see this theme in the main menu of the game, where most games would have the option for you to start a new game. Planescape asks you if you would like to start a new life, or resume an old life. It's one in a number of ways that the game makes you consider the consequences of your choices, and the insignificance of a single life when it comes to the Nameless one. Doug Stanhope once described a DMT trip as an experience that told him the meaning of life. He described a black void with data flowing in streams towards a swirling black hole. The picture conjures ideas in my head of time and how it swallows up information and deletes it. Every time a person dies, they take with them their perception. Their perception of the world is unique. Everyone's is, because that perception is randomly generated by a series of events that have happened to you or that you willingly participated in. The entirety of the Nameless One's life in his later incarnations is like an infinitely expressing idea of this. With each death, his particular way of thinking in that incarnation is wiped away, and the only thing left of him is the writing and history he created in the world. If time is constantly devouring memory, then what exists of the Nameless One when he dies? Nothing but a memory that's slowly fading out of the memories of others. And therefore, history is deleting itself one soul at a time. Is regret truly the thing that can change the nature of a man, or is the answer, in fact, mutable? The thing that can change the man is the thing the man experiences.
Today, a young man on acid realized that all matter is merely energy condensed to a slow vibration, that we are all one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. There is no such thing as death. Life is only a dream, and we're the imagination of ourselves.
In one incarnation, the Nameless One was a petty thief, scraping by a living underground. In another incarnation, it is said that he led a revolt in what was known at the time to be the Prime Ward, and that the revolt brought him under the gaze of the Lady of Pain, who quickly crushed the uprising, but did not maze him. He must have provided her with some measure of entertainment, the kind of sickly pleasure that comes from watching a blind man stumble his way along the perpetually changing streets of Sigil. And what of Sigil? Sigil is called the City of Doors, as it acts as a sort of nexus point to other dimensions. If you were to picture the prime material plane as a golf ball, then the world of Sigil and the planes that it connects to would be like the skin of an onion that wraps itself transparently along the surface, and only accessible to those that know that it's there, and to those who number even fewer that possess the key to open the doors. The world of Sigil is one of mystery and of metaphor given life. The people who often speak in strange ways that seem to make no sense until you understand the factions that make up the social structures of the City of Doors. Take the Chaos Men, or the Chaos Attacks as they are called. You may be able to look at the average homeless basher on the street yelling at a single stone on the cobblestone streets and figure that this guy's clearly nuts, and you might be right. But just because he is yelling at something you can't see doesn't mean it's not there. The only real way to tell your average addled barker from a Chaos Man is to speak to them, and hear their odd, seemingly scrambled syntax, and even with their seemingly unintelligible speak, they still somehow make sense. Knowing the factions helps us understand the nature of Sigil. Every faction, in some way, is a personification of a feeling or a personality type turned up to 11. Don't believe me? Take any sample of factions at random and you will see they are almost like a feeling dwelled upon until it becomes a philosophy. Like the Sensates, or my favorites, the Bleakers, a group that's so nihilistic they don't even bother preaching their tenets and prefer to sit back as life heaps its miseries upon them. But who was the Nameless One in his original incarnation? Well, I'm glad you asked, because there's a lot of information out there, but the most helpful I've seen is a bit of fan fiction, but it's probably more appropriate to call it documentation of the game's plot, by Rice Hess. He follows the events of the story as closely as he could, and he lays out who the Nameless One was according to the unreliable narrator of, quote, an advisor whose lying advice wrought betrayal. A contract was signed, a crime committed, apparently one so awful that the acts of all future incarnations of the Nameless One pale in comparison. This lying advisor is likely Morte. The Nameless One made a deal with the night hag Ravel Puzzlewell to grant him immortality so that his future incarnations could atone for the crime he had committed. The resulting deal left the Nameless One with fragments of his full memory upon each death, and with those memories gone, the Nameless One was simultaneously a sign of chaos and a sort of predictable order, in that each time he died, you could be assured that he would start from the same blank slate. This likely resulted in him being taken advantage of often, and used by powers who were more aware of his state than he was. In this way, from the very start of the game, we are presented, by Morte, with the notes from his Practical Incarnation, which were written indelibly upon the Nameless One's skin. We can guess that Morte is the unreliable narrator from the previous example because when we reach the Nameless One's tomb, we find that the full tattoo on the tablet has more to it than what Morte actually read. The Nameless One, and by extension, the story, represents the chaos of nature and of nurture. The idea that none of us can control the circumstances for which we come into this world, and how those circumstances can and do influence how we react to the world, and who we become for positive or for negative. The Nameless One is like the embodiment of chaos in that any incarnation, depending on the circumstances he finds himself in, could be the embodiment of law and order, or chaotic evil, or any other alignment. He represents chaos in its purest form to those who meet him in each of his incarnations because they never know who they'll be dealing with from one life to the next. But what does this have to do with changing the nature of the man? That is the theme of the game after all. If the Nameless One is the embodiment of chaos, then does he have a natural state? It's a valid question because it would reason that someone who is different each time you meet them would have no natural state. But he does, and I believe this state is a want that is universally shared by most people either consciously or subconsciously, an idea that unless understood and actively pursued by men and women, then they are likely to be dissatisfied with life in some way. I believe that nature is in the knowing of oneself. Knowing one's true nature, who they are, what they are capable of, and in knowing, grow to their full potential. But the Nameless One is unreliable. His memories are fractured and missing. We cannot rely upon him or his writings to give a faithful recollection of his actions. And since I believe that intent does not matter and instead, what matters most is how your intentions are experienced by others, let's explore the Nameless One through the eyes of the people who knew him and who have met him for the first time. So let's dig in, shall we?
So this one's going to require a little bit of explanation. Back in the 90s, TSR was publishing Dungeons & Dragons. This was before Wizards of the Coast bought them and before Hasbro bought Wizards of the Coast. TSR was licensing out various of the campaign world, and Planescape was one of them. The original designer for Planescape, the creator of Planescape, Zeb Cook, had left and moved to California to work on computer games. And so I, along with Monty Cook, stepped up to become one of the primary designers on the Planescape license. And I wrote things like Well of Worlds, an adventure setting, Planes of Law and Planes of Conflict, two massive boxes describing some of the outer planes, as well as a box called Hellbound: The Blood War, which detailed the massive war between the demons and devils of the lower planes. So I was extraordinarily familiar with the Planescape license. When I decided that it was time for me to leave the company because I wanted to move to California, I was put in touch with Fergus Urquhart, who was the director of the role-playing division at the time. This is before it was called Black Isle Studios. And so he interviewed me and he hired me and I moved out there. I was originally supposed to be working on a PlayStation game similar to Kingsfield, which was the precursor to games like Bloodborne and Dark Souls, but that was canceled when Interplay Management suddenly realized, wait a second, we've got 3 Planescape games in production. We should probably only make one of them, because we don't want to pin all of our RPG hopes on a single license. So they converted one of the titles into Stonekeep 2. They canceled the PlayStation one that I was working on, and then they sent me over onto the Last Rites team, and that became Planescape Torment eventually.
Daken is a Gith-Zerai, who was once the leader of the city of Shraklator. Okay, I'm not even going to try and say that. Through psionics, the Gith-Zerai are able to shape the living chaos in their home in the plane of Limbo into a livable city. The Gith-Zerai, which I will now refer to from now on as the Gith for the sake of my tongue, not to be confused with the Gith-Yankee, were once slaves to the Illithid until Zerthamon, who the Gith now revere as a god, became the first of the people to become fully self-aware, and thus gained resistance to the mental attacks of the powerful mind-eating Illithids. Zerthamon freed his people from Illithid control, and this is where Daken comes in. Daken was considered a spiritual leader of the Gith-Zerai, but while translating the writings of the Circles of Zerthamon, he had a crisis of faith, which stunted his growth in the Gith mystical arts. Daken was relied upon for his powerful words that reinforced the willpower of the people of Limbo to maintain the city that was built of chaos matter. But his crisis of faith became heretic thoughts, and the city came tumbling down. An earlier incarnation of the Nameless One saved Daken before he succumbed to the results of his lack of faith. Knowing that should Daken swear allegiance to him until the Nameless One died, that he would have a willing slave for eternity, as Daken could not have possibly known he swore a life bond to an immortal. If we ask Daken to teach us the words of Zerthamon, he opens the unbroken circle for us to study the teachings. These teachings reinforce the nature of a man theme in an interesting way. It is no mere coincidence that the Bible, which Daken carries with him, is a circle, for a circle is infinite yet has a beginning and an end. And if one travels in one direction for too long, one finds himself back where they started. Daken's life is circular. His people broke free of their slavery to the Illithid, and in doing so, gained their freedom, only to have Daken, like the Gith before them, become a slave due to his ignorance of the Nameless One's true nature. When we meet Daken, he is the metaphorical representation of the Gith, in a way. He is back at a place where his people had begun. Before we get into Daken's people and what they represent, let's talk about some hoity-toity ideas like structuralism, functionalism, and existentialism. Take the idea of a kitchen table. You can see it and identify it by its function. You know its function because you have used it for that purpose before, so in our mind, we catalog the item by a name, by a purpose, and the function it serves. The table is given a purpose before it is designed and fabricated, and we know that purpose because we know it is a table. But what if you've never seen a table before? To you, the table may look like a tall bed or structured kindling. Without knowing the purpose of something, we cannot know its function. Therefore, the object is a mystery to us. Knowing this, picture the Gith as a baby race, still in development, who are still discovering who they are. They do not know the world around them, and they do not have words for the varieties of things that it includes. Without words, things only have functions, but no names with which to grant meaning, which is easily passed on to others. As the baby race grew, the Illithid came and stole their minds, and then corralled them together like a herd of cows made to be slaves. Their development emotionally and intellectually stops at this point. The gift did not question why they were slaves, nor did they have a word to describe what they were. Being slaves was their only reality. It was normal for them. Zerthimon was the first to see the folly in this way of thinking. Zerthimon knew the histories of his people, knew that they were drawn of chaos, shaped by it. They drew a place to live within the chaos and dwelled there, comfortable in their knowing. But being made of flesh was new to them, and they had yet to know their flesh for themselves. They fell into typical sentient problems like greed, anger, hatred, pain, and joy, and all those emotions fed the emotions of the other people. And the people became divided. The Illithid found them easy to enslave. Through the influence of the Illithid, the people came to know death, both of body and the mind. They came to know of the horror of being made to feel joy in the act of being consumed. A joy they were no doubt made to feel by the Illithid's invasive influence. Zerthimon made the first steps towards self-awareness when he discovered a dead husk in the poisoned fields of the Illithids. There, the brain had not been consumed. It was the first time that he had seen death that was not caused by consumption. He came to realize that this body had been destroyed by a blade of metal. Knowing this, he came to know that steel was stronger than the flesh, and in knowing this, came to know the Illithid's weakness. This revelation may seem obvious to us, but to someone without an education in such things, and with very little experience to draw upon, this was nothing short of a revelation to Zerthimon. From the scripture of steel, the Gith were on the first step towards being freed of their enslavement. Much like the Nameless one, the Gith became whole once they knew themselves, and had an enemy to fight to give their lives purpose. Without this knowledge, they would have been damned to be slaves, never knowing the tools of their possible freedom. In the third and fourth circle, the revelations are about freedom. The third circle is a revelation about loyalty and the power of ideas. The sustaining power of ideas. Zerthimon was tortured for the knowledge that he had gained, but instead of being broken, he steeled himself, sustained the torture, and left with his seekers to live on and create an uprising. Through torture, through pain, you endure, and in enduring, you grow strong. This is perhaps the most important lesson, especially to Daken. The idea that to know pain and to endure it is to lose your fear of it. This is the shattering of a shackle for which your overseers have to control you. Without fear of pain or death, you are free. The fourth circle speaks of being blind to truth and acts as an almost opposite lesson to the third circle. As a slave, you are only worth what service you provide. When Vilkar betrayed his people for reasons of greed, he had blinded himself to his own reality. The reality that when he no longer provided the enslavers with an eye through which to see what they could not, he became nothing more than food and was consumed and used as fertilizer in the poison fields. The fifth circle is about leadership. How a leader by herself is not just about individual strength, but in knowing how your example can manifest the hidden strength within others. Without an example of power, the slave is but a serf. They have no power. But seeing another elevated brings the realization that anyone could achieve this power should they have the willpower and belief to manifest it. After the sixth circle, which is one that Daken no longer knows, 2 more circles can be unlocked. In this, the Nameless one becomes the teacher to Daken. The seventh circle speaks of time as an ally, that through patience one can temper the sword to a fine edge that can cut through any material, flesh or otherwise. And this is the most meaningful to the Nameless one, for his entire story is a story of patience. Through his numerous deaths, the Nameless one has learned time and time again about himself, learning that it is not enough to know oneself, but to know their effect on others and how that effect changes over time and exposure. That through extending his lifespan, he hoped to atone for the sins he created in his first incarnation, yet achieved only to create more sins to atone for, never getting closer to his goal.
I don't know that I would say it was a particularly difficult game to get off the ground. It took a while for us to get it made, and that's in part because when the original three designers behind Fallout left, the management decided to pull everybody on our team onto Fallout 2 to make sure that game got completed in time. So we had a short hiatus to make Fallout 2, and it turns out that was actually for the good of the project, because it gave us the advantage that we had an additional game under our belt, so we had more idea of what it was that would and would not work in our own game. It was a challenge to switch back and forth between them, but it was definitely a good thing for us that we got Fallout 2 done first. You know, Cursed is kind of a funny story. It was supposed to be really different, actually. But one of the scripters, when I told him what our plans were for this area, he said, "Ooh, no, we can't do that." And I said, crap, okay. So I dialed it way back and turned it into something else, and I wasn't really happy with what we had, but, you know, at least it was getting done. And then toward the end of the project, Adam Heine, who had recently come on, said, "No, we can totally do that." And I sort of flipped out a little bit. I was fairly pissed off about it, but he and Scott Warner really managed to get the scripting together to make that a much more solid area than it was. I mean, it was kind of turning into a disaster, frankly, so I am really grateful to those guys for helping save it.
Dayanara loved the practical incarnation of the Nameless One. She was used, through her intense love of him, as a sacrifice at the fortress of his regrets, knowing that her tormented soul would act as a scout in the place where no living thing could sustain itself for long. At the Sensorium, you were confronted with a memory of Dayanara. Told through her eyes, you experience her feelings, the intense longing for you, the feelings of inadequacy manipulated by you to make her loyal, to make her longing for you painful. The feeling is described as a sensation of drowning, of hunger, like a poisonous serpent were in your chest, dripping venom into your heart. In the vision, you are Dayanara, wiping away the tears of longing for yourself, the self that stands before Dayanara, in shadows, sweet words spilling from his mouth like candy-smelling bile. You have waited for his return, wondering the same thought 1,000 times and more. Will he ever return? And from nowhere, there he is. You, standing before her, echoing words you know you've said before. You wish you could stop her from helping him, the practical incarnation. You try to scream out to her, to tell her to move on. He's just using her. But you cannot convince her. This moment is set in stone. It has already happened. And like the unbroken circle, when we meet her in this new life for the first time, she is as she once was, as in love with us as when we betrayed her love. She has traveled the length and breadth of the circle and wound up where she started. The brilliant part about this conversation in the Sensorium is that it is at first, in many subtle ways, that the game tells you about who you are. You could simply turn away from this memory whenever you please and feel nothing for the woman. If her plight does not concern you, then you need not concern yourself with it. It says something about the callousness of your character, if you chose to look at it that way. But if you go through the pain with her, you've forced yourself to understand it, cry bloody tears for her, and store the empathy for her inside of you, it says something about your incarnation as well. It says that you're not like the others. That in this life, you may be that much closer to changing the nature of this particular man.
I would say it was probably pretty well laid out in the fantastic design documents Chris Avalone wrote for us. He had described the areas fairly thoroughly. We had a lot of leeway to play in here, but he defined the flavor for us. And because I'd been working on Planescape for so long at TSR, I knew Sigil inside and out. And I had a lot of very specific ideas for what the characters should feel like and what they should act like. And so it was not really that difficult for me to be able to provide the guidance, both for myself and for the other team if they had questions about what a Planescape character should feel like. But, Chris Avalon was the person who was in charge of it all, and we would run the ideas past Chris so that he would have, some notion of what we were doing, and he could give us a thumbs up or a thumbs down. And that was pretty much all the guidance we needed on it.
Morte is known as Mortimer Rictusgrin. He calls himself a mimir, but he is unlike a mimir in almost every way. As a floating encyclopedia, you would think that there would be much that Morte knows, not only about the planes, but also about you and your journey, but he is as cagey and hides things from us at nearly every turn. Take even his backstory for evidence of his lying tongue. When asked about how you ended up as a floating skull, he mentioned something that many Dungeons & Dragons veterans may have heard of, which is the Head of Vecna. The Head of Vecna is a well-known cursed item said to be the severed head of a powerful lich from the Ravenloft setting. It isn't, though. It is said in the lore that a bard who carried with him a severed head in a bag created the story of finding the head and claimed it was none other than the Head of Vecna. This claim brought him much acclaim, and Vecna, who watched with amusement after death, imbued the head with powers to fool the bard and others who happened to find it. In a practical sense, the head is a trap. It speaks to adventurers that find it and claims that they could absorb the powers of Vecna if they simply cut off their head and replace the Head of Vecna onto their corpse. Morte is implying that he was one of the unfortunate and stupid adventurers who fell for this trap. This tale doesn't wash. Fall from Grace mentions in our journey that Morte has the smell of Beator on him, and that squares with what we discover about Morte and how we pulled him from the Pillar of Skulls in Beator. So why lie? We can divine some truths about Morte's motivations from taking a look at his alignment. As we know about our previous incarnations, the Nameless One hasn't always been Mr. Nice Guy, and because of this, having someone like Morte, a chaotic good character, leading us and leaving out info about our past, Morte can act as a sculptor with clay, helping to keep us on a good track. But that doesn't really explain why he lies. Well, Morte wasn't always a floating skull, and at one time, the very first incarnation of the Nameless One, also referred to many as the Good Incarnation, met with Morte. Morte lied to the Nameless One and told him that Ravel Puzzlewell could help the Nameless One become immortal, which was only half the truth. For his lies, Morte was placed upon the Pillar of Liars in Beator, the punishment reserved for those that cause the death of another through their lies. Morte lies in hopes that the Nameless One will never discover the truth, but also just as likely to keep him on the good path for as long as he can. He lies because it is who he is, and it goes back once again to the unbroken circle, and how seemingly nothing can change the nature of a person. Everyone we meet who is important is unchanged from when we knew them in previous incarnations. Morte is no different. Each character carries with them a torment, or a guilt if you will, and that guilt puts them into a loop of behavior that cannot be broken, for a habit, once formed, is very difficult to give up. Fel is the Davus that walks on ground, the one that the Lady of Pain cast down and will soon fall under her gaze. He tells us that he knows about us, but cannot tell us what he knows because he cannot change the nature of a man. He tells us that we are marked by the sign of Torment, which tracks all tormented souls to the Nameless One. One of the previous incarnations traveled with 4 companions, each marked by Torment. Fel describes them in a very flowery way. Deonara is the one who loves one who does not love. Zachariah, the blind archer, is the one who does not see what others see and sees what others do not. One who is familiar and bound with duty is Morte, and one who is a slave and his chains are words is Daken. This is interesting if we look at this from the theme of perspective contributing to reality, because not knowing who we are or what we've done in the past gives our character room to grow into whatever truth we decide for him. But when it is revealed that people who have traveled with us have been lying to us, and have traveled with us before, people we thought we knew become suddenly suspicious. When visiting the tomb of the Nameless One, we find a message on the wall that states we shouldn't trust the skull. Daken lies to us if we ask him to translate the Fel's words. He does this because to admit he is a slave is to admit he has not learned the teachings of Zerthamon, and to accept his weakness. In accepting weakness, he accepts that the torment that follows him is in fact his to carry. Each of these characters have a reason for not only traveling with us, but also in keeping the secret that they've done so before. Perhaps they are along for the ride, seeing which incarnation of the Nameless One will arise this time. Or perhaps they are hoping to see an end to the Nameless One's torment, and perhaps the torment that binds them as brothers and sisters to him. Ravel Puzzlewell is a Grey Lady of the Wastes. It is said that she once threatened to open the cage of Sigil and let the chaos of the planes in to destroy it, but that she came under the gaze of the Lady of Pain and she was mazed, sent to a pocket dimension that would become her prison until she was penned in a dead book. Many believed Ravel to be dead. Some believe that she may still reside in the maze, but all of them seem to agree that Ravel is a dangerous hag who brings nothing but ill to those that speak to her. Before she was mazed, those that sought her out ended up dead and sometimes displayed as a warning to others who came seeking her power for themselves. As a test of their wisdom, Ravel asked her victims riddles which no mortal can divine the answer of, and for their failure, they die. The question most commonly asked is, what can change the nature of a man? But the twist is not in the answer. So many men and women came to Ravel seeking to give her the answer they thought she wanted, which was her answer.
What can change the nature of a man?
When we confront Ravel in her maze and give her our answer, she tells us, countless times has the question been asked, and not once did the pathetic shells who came afore me answer with their answer, but always sought to creep inside my mind and find what I thought. There is no truth in that. There's no truth in what she said either, because no matter what these people said before they arrive, they would have been wrong. Because it wasn't their answer she was looking for. She was looking for the Nameless One's answer, and no one else's would do. It becomes obvious that Ravel was once in love with us, the original incarnation specifically, and that we promised her, just like Dayanara, that we would return to her. But these were the words of a man not to be believed. The Practical Incarnation, or as I like to call him, the psychopath, left in his wake shattered lives and hearts of both the beautiful and the feared. Ravel asks us one more question. What do you feel for these that have come with you? Do they matter in your heart, or are they tools for your will? Your answer to this simple question will decide what kind of person the Nameless One is in this incarnation. All it takes is this one conversation, this one choice to color all of your actions up to now and whatever shade is cast by your answer. Your choices are, they matter to me, or tools only, nothing more. They follow for reasons of their own and their skills I will use. Or, my feelings for my companions are a matter between them and I. This choice makes obvious who your Nameless One is. Is he another incarnation of the psychopath? Or something else? Something Ravel hasn't seen before? In other words, are you traveling down the same doomed path you have traveled so many times before? Or have you learned your lesson and changed your nature? There's also a bit of interesting information about Ravel that I didn't discover in my first playthrough, or more likely, I, like the Nameless One, simply forgot. Ravel is able to shapeshift. Not only this, but she is living multiple lives. She has been, in multiple occasions, people who have in some way helped us in our journey. The first person we meet who helps us is the dusty Ivain. Ivain helps us by threading and embalming our wounds, which gives us an increase to our HP, and she is also Mebeth, the kindly old witch we meet in Ragpicker Square. Mebeth is the interesting one here, because when asked about Ravel, she claims that Ravel is an evil we should not seek out. If Ravel is Mebeth, which is confirmed in a way by the fact that making certain dialogue choices with Mebeth will increase Ravel's stats later, if in fact she is Mebeth, then that means that Ravel herself is not a whole person, that her personality has splintered into different personas, and in Mebeth is a persona that cares enough for the Nameless One to ensure he never meets the other Ravel, and tries to steer him off that path. In a way, Ravel's personalities work against her own interest. It also brings up the question, if Ravel exists in the maze and outside the maze, Why does she stay in her prison? It's likely that Ravel, who is in love with the original incarnation of the Nameless One, is waiting there for him to come back to her and in some way make her complete. When Ravel dies, Mebeth doesn't die, however, so this must mean that Ravel, like the Nameless One, is leaving shadows of herself in the planes after her death, and the evil incarnation of herself has died and left what are essentially her children behind.
No longer shall you trouble existence with your presence, witch.
As for the specific design philosophies of areas like the Brothel, a lot of that just came down to the fact that Chris really, really hated a lot of the tropes that were so common in fantasy gaming at the time. He wanted to make sure that we were doing something different, and that it wasn't just going to be, standard fantasy fare. And that's why you will see no elves in the game, why there are very few swords in the game, and why the Nameless One can't pick up a sword at all. And it's just because the idea is that Chris wanted to make a game that would be so radically different from what was out there that it would subvert people's expectations, turn them completely on their head. And this is something that a lot of games have tried to do, and I think that you can probably thank Chris Avallone for the idea that we need to step past the standards in fantasy games and literature in order to create something new and better.
The Brothel is one of my favorite sections of the game as it reinforces quite heavily the ideas the theme creates. Fall from Grace says that her reason for creating the Brothel was due to her involvement with the Sensates, the Society of Sensation, or a faction in Planescape that seek to experience fully the universe of passion, pleasures, pain, and torment that the planes has to offer. They believe that the senses hold power, that there is a real, tangible value to experience. They believe that the multiverse only exists to the point at which you have stopped experiencing it. They believe that without experiencing the multiverse, it essentially doesn't exist. For only that which we see, hear, taste, and feel are real, and everything else is an enigma, or imaginary, until it has manifested itself before us. In a way, they believe that as they experience, they create. Because for something to be nothing until it is experienced is to say that through experiencing, we create reality. This is a problem further compounded by the fact that everyone can experience things like death differently given their circumstances. The Sensates are essentially explorers of the realm of sensation. They have a prison where they leave those that wish to abandon their exploration and instead rot away, indulging in simple, carnal pleasures throughout their life. A true Sensate is calculating with their risks, but nonetheless wishes to experience both pleasure and pain to expand their knowledge of the universe and of the universe inside themselves. The Nameless One was a Sensate in one of his earlier incarnations. I've heard many theories about his scars, but could it be that he acquired most of those scars from the Society of Sensation? It's an interesting question. Could he have self-mutilated to feel the pain that he inflicted on others? To make it real to him? The scars serve as a reminder to him to the pain that he has inflicted upon others, even if he cannot remember their origins. Perhaps this would make him more careful when inflicting pain on others. Fall from Grace wished to slake the intellectual curiosity of even the most hardened intellectual by allowing them to experience what is at times life-threatening realities without putting themselves in any sort of danger, to experience things like death without dying. When speaking to her, the Nameless One tells her that he has lost himself and his memories, and that he is on a search to find out who he is and why he came to this plane of existence. As a Sensate, this intrigues Fall from Grace. In order to get her to join our party, she suggests that we speak to the other 10 Brothel Sensates, and by doing so, we may learn something about ourselves. Take the debate we have with Delora. In the middle of our debate, a memory surfaces of our past. We remember standing in a great hall at the cusp of winning a debate centering around existence. We are attempting to convince another person that they do not exist. And it seems we're winning the debate. At the moment of realization, when the opponent is realizing that we may actually be right, they disappear. Poofed, out of existence, in front of onlookers as if they had never existed in the first place. This enforces the perception as reality theme, and that we are only as real as we believe we are. And in this game's eyes, so are our experiences. But was that also the power of the onlookers as well? If we do not exist, but others see us, are we only tangible because of the experiences of others? Perhaps this man disappearing was as much the fault of his own doubt as well as the doubt of others watching the debate. Now, Vivienne is an example of what people are like when they lose something that they deem that is important to who they see themselves as. Something so innocuous as her personal scent, when stolen, turns her into a bitter, angry person. This happens because something that made her who she was has been taken from her. But once returned, she becomes kind enough to take notice of us and grant us the favor of changing our own personal scent from the foul smell of death to something much more alluring. Much like how we wander in confusion when we don't know who we are because our memories are gone, and thus we have become a different person. Loss can often turn us into something that we don't recognize. The theme here is reinforced in nearly every aspect because in one way or another, save for maybe two of the sensates, each one learns something about themselves through experiencing something they haven't experienced before. Like Juliet and her star-crossed lover Montague experiencing relationship turmoil for the first time. Nenny discovering how easy it is to be mean. Or Delora getting the keys to her heart back and struggling to understand what these new feelings that she's developing are. Every story reinforces the theme of what changes the nature of people, and that answer to the sensates is experience.
This was a relatively young team with relatively young people, and we didn't have a lot of the tools that were necessary for us to get the stuff done ourselves. So, like, for instance, when we were writing dialogues, we would have to write them out in a Word document and then pass them over to a programmer to input these things for us. And they got pretty tired of the cut and paste, and eventually one of them created a tool for us to do this ourselves, but it took a while to get that. And then, there was the adjusting to the Infinity engine, which was relatively new at the time for us. So we had to make, those allowances. We had to learn the boundaries, essentially, of what was and wasn't possible in that engine.
Let's talk about gameplay. Because I could end the video here, but since this is a game, we gotta talk about gameplay at least. If you were to describe Planescape Torment, how would you describe it? I would describe this game as an adventure game first and an RPG second. I know, blasphemy, but it is true if you look at the game very closely, as I have these past few weeks. It shares quite a lot in common with older computer adventure games in that, in order to get your bearings and figure out what your next move is, you must talk to people. And holy bleeping bleep in a bleep store will you be talking to a whole lot of people. Guinness Book of World Records says that Fallout New Vegas holds the record for most lines of dialogue in a game. Now, I tried searching for this on the Guinness website, but could not find an entry for Fallout New Vegas, or anything about lines of dialogue though. I will say this though, their search algorithm is absolute shit. Nonetheless, I have no idea who started this rumor, but they is dumb. Fallout New Vegas has 60,000 lines of dialogue, and Planescape has around 75,000 and about an 800,000 word count. So yeah, that's a lot of dialogue. That may sound dry and boring to you, and if you're the type of person who avoids reading as if it were going to give you eye cancer, then yeah, this isn't your type of game. But if, on the other hand, you are the type of person who likes rich, unique lore, incredible world building, absolutely batty characters, genius, and at times hilarious dialogue, this game is your one and only for eternity. The brunt of this game is investigatory. Since you has the amnesia, you spend most of your time bothering people on the streets or in their homes, or when they're disguised as an armoire so they can live the life as a repository for frilly ladies' garments. Most of the game is spent talking, exploring, and fighting, which I will get into. I will get into that later. As you investigate, more and more of your past is revealed to you through dialogue and memory sequences that arise from certain triggers, like objects and people and sometimes sensations. Now, it would sound boring, like you were simply reading a book, but this game does dialogue exquisitely! What I mean by this is instead of watching two people talk like in Mass Effect 3 or having limited choices that mean nothing in dialogue like Witcher 3, what is it about threes? You're given choices, often enough to keep you engaged because the game is asking more of you than simple reading. It's asking you to read, absorb, think about what all that means, and respond in a way that you think is appropriate for the situation. Dialogue can be a drag in a lot of games, but in Planescape, it's engaging, which is a pretty good thing because it's what you're going to be doing the most. The other part of this game is the quest system, which is essentially a breadcrumb type mission where you gather clues from various people around town, and this is where the game kind of grinds to a halt. See, I don't know about everybody else, but I've only played through Planescape once in the past, and that was a long time ago. And I remember having a hell of a time finding the next story mission back then. And now that I am used to all the hand-holding from games now, I feel a lot like I had an even harder time in this most recent playthrough. This is an old school RPG, which means you need to talk to everyone to find out who you are actually supposed to talk to next. And sometimes who you need to talk to next is the problem, because no one you talk to knows exactly where that person is. Then the gameplay goes from absolutely engaging to an absolute pain in the ass, because these cities are absolutely dense with population, to a fault. And until you leave the starting area, there is no fast travel. Essentially, you'll be spending an inordinate amount of time dragging your mouse over random NPCs to see what their name is, in order to see if this is the person you need to talk to. This could have been fixed in the game if it had an option to highlight containers and NPC names like Baldur's Gate did. But it doesn't, so you have to spend your time in good old adventure game fashion pixel hunting for containers and NPCs. If I had to fault the game with anything, it would probably be this, and it's no small matter either. When your game is mostly about one thing, finding clues and specific people, but you hide those people behind clutter and tedium, that's something you should address. Now, I will be the first to admit that this is like, I don't know, an old game, and, I'm mentioning problems that can no longer be fixed. Shucks. But, it's something I felt like I needed to at least bring up, And, I also think that I was playing in an HD resolution, and I think maybe that broke a lot of things, including some of the cutscenes. I think that newer games have spoiled me, however, and I think that's the real problem. It's always nice to go back to these kind of games because it makes you realize something about yourself. In this playthrough of the game, I found that my ability to reasonably deduce where I should go next has been drastically hindered. There was a time, like in the Clerk's Ward, when I was trying to figure out what I was supposed to be doing next. And I walked all around town trying to remember how to get to the sensory stone that had Ravel in it. See, logically I was looking for a door that would lead me there, but I couldn't find one in the fest hall, so I walked everywhere trying to find the friggin' thing and eventually gave up and went online to figure out what to do next. Because when I found out what I needed to do, and that all I had to do is just talk to Splinter at the front door of the fest hall, who was essentially the only guy I hadn't talked to, I remembered something about these kinds of games. They require patience. They require you to engage with them thoughtfully. From this point on, I paid much more attention to what was going on. I stopped alt-tabbing out to write more of my script. I allowed myself to be immersed into the world and the writing. And this is what you need for this to be an enjoyable experience. Now let's talk about combat. It's okay, I guess? I mean, there's really not much here that's special, and to be honest, you won't be doing much of it. I mean, there is a decent list of spells, but they aren't nothing special, to be honest. Okay, I say you're not going to be doing much of it until you get to Curse. Now, there's some strategy to be had in combat, and some encounters can be intense, but for the most part, it is click, wait, heal, wait some more, then eventually things die. There's really not a lot to be said for the combat, so I'll just stop right there. In my opinion, Numenera had much better combat, but okay, we'll get to that later.
Well, let's see. There's the fact that we had just a lot of trash monsters. I did a playthrough on Twitch of the first bit of Planescape in the Hive, And I found that the constant attacking by trash mobs, the hive thugs just constantly chasing you around and getting into fights with you, that was annoying as hell. But for a more structural thing, honestly, and I mentioned this before, I would go back and I would fix up Cursed. I would try and re-implement some of the original ideas I had there so that it would be less chaotic and, more focused. I would also really like to do more on Beator as well. I felt that we underserved the devils of that plane by just having them be roaming monster squads as opposed to a full-on devilish adventure, but I suppose that's getting out of scope.
Sidequests. Sidequests are at times wonderful, even more intriguing than the main quest at times, and Planescape excels in this regard for a couple of reasons. First is depth. If you were to look at a side mission the way a dungeon master likely looks at it, you are looking at it as if it were its own, self-contained little adventure. I believe the main problem with so many other games that do side missions is that they make the content an optional aside inside an already fleshed out mission. So tell me if you've heard this one before. You walk into a dungeon and along the way you stumble across a side path to a small room. On a table in that room is an item. You pick it up, and then the game informs you that you've completed a mission. Cool. Like I said in the Andromeda video, that's not fun. That is passive. I didn't have to think about the quest, I just needed to go down every side path until I found the thing to check a box. This sucks so bad! I hate design like this because it only exists to just pad out playtime. Planescape in general doesn't waste your time with quests like this. Every quest that I have run across, save for a few exceptions, are fully fleshed out missions that could act as a one-off campaign in just about any session of Dungeons & Dragons, and honestly, that is my judge of a quality RPG. Numenera is a lot like this game in both story and side quests, and you know what? And speaking of Numenera, let's talk about something that I don't think I actually talked about in my Tides of Numenera video, and that's the difference between the two games.
What do I miss most about old school game design? As far as the process of designing it, I would say that it's just that anarchic feeling of flying sort of by the seat of our pants as we were designing this stuff. But I don't think that would really translate well to the modern era. Making games is expensive, and if you let people go off and dick around and do too much of their own thing, you could potentially wind up wasting a lot of money. We got lucky that we had fairly good instincts, but it could have easily gone sideways if we hadn't. So while I miss that, I don't think it's necessarily a good approach to bring back.
Now, I've often wondered why people disliked Tides of Numenera, and a lot of people say that they quit very close to the beginning, and I think I might know why that is. So let's talk about that a little bit. I think a lot of the problem that people have with this game comes down to humor. Bear with me here. Starting a new life in Planescape starts you off with an interaction with what is probably the best character in the game, or just about any game, and that is the Mimir Morte. What precedes is a bit of exposition disguised as humorous banter. This eases the player into what is going to be an existential experience that is less concerned with gamification and much more concerned with the experience of experiencing. Humor can often deflate tension, but many comedians believe that humor can often impart difficult ideas that most would reject if told in a dry, analytical way, but is more easily digested if you can get a person to laugh. In an Oxford paper titled Theories in the Effect of Political Humor, they attempt to answer the question, does humor affect the cognition of political facts? In this paper, they state that superiority theory proposes that humor capitalizes on the sudden glory of realizing that we may be superior to someone else, and that the release of tension theories of Freud state that humor is a tension release valve, through which built-up anxiety about events or topics that induce stress can melt away when laughed at, as if the mind lessens the impact of these tensions because it no longer takes them seriously, or at least in the moment. Echo has lost her ability to speak. You can solve this problem by purchasing for her a fiend's tongue. You solve one problem, but you create another. A typical gag setup and punchline that works on just about every level. The Fiend's tongue speaks for her. Once again, she is forced into silence by our good intentions. When we buy the Deva's tears and silence the tongue, predictably, Echo is a different person now. We have our setup, the punchline, but the payoff, you see, is in the deepening of the themes. Echo was valuable as a prostitute because her clients often came to her because of her ability to listen without interruption. Now that she has given back her ability to speak, she wonders if it's time for her to move on. This works so effectively because unlike the Guardians of the Galaxy way of humor, the Planescape layout is like this: setup, punchline, emotional payoff. With the Marvel film structure, it's setup, emotional payoff, punchline. Now, the impact of that emotional payoff is undercut by the joke. It just doesn't work the same. It isn't as satisfying. When immersing yourself in such serious and dry topics as to the nature of existence and life's purpose, it is essential that we remember to laugh. Because laughter is a part of life, it's a pivotal one. People who are far too serious often do not see the truth, because they're too obsessed with the grimy, terrible parts of life. If you can laugh at the terrible bits, they lose their power. Tides of Numenera may have forgotten this. The way it opens with walls of humorless text, a battle, then many more humorless and serious tasks, it is a shame, really, because so many people have missed this amazing experience in Numenera, and I'm sure that humor plays a small part. But maybe it isn't the full explanation, but it was something that was missing from Numenera, and therefore, it changed its meaning. Just like the people in the brothel had their meanings changed when they lost a little bit of who they were, and just like the Nameless one with his missing memories and missing meaning, a small change can change the nature of a game.
The hollowness of RPGs and other games is sort of a personal interpretation of it, but I would say that what you're seeing is probably related to the fact that games are really expensive to make these days. And you can't go too far into taking risks in creating them, because then you risk alienating your audience. And if you try to do something too ambitious and it doesn't hit, then you've just wasted years and millions of dollars. And unless you've got a serious cushion, that could be the end of your studio. So you've got to be really careful with how far you can take these things and how much risk you're willing to take. And I don't think that a lot of studios are willing to make that jump because they've got a lot of people counting on them. I mean, it's a fair assessment. It's a fair business decision for them to not do this. That's why you see the main risk takers being in the indie space these days. And if you're looking for different games, then I would suggest looking to some of the indie titles, and then you'll find some really out there ideas, and it will restore your faith in humanity.
This has been a rant from Strat-Edgy, and now that you've heard it, go play some games.
That's about all for me. I hope that I've answered your questions sufficiently, and if you've got any more questions for me, feel free to hit me up. You can reach me on Twitter at Colin McComb, surprisingly. And you can also check out my own game company, 3 Pound Games. We're focusing on some VR titles right now because VR is freaking amazing. Again, thank you for the opportunity to talk to you, talk to your listeners, and keep in touch. Thank you.